Okay, today we're going to look at the question of the Hadith. Now, already in Pakistan, as you know, since the time of Ghulam Ahmad Parvez and to a much lesser extent, let's say, things that the Farahi school has said, Hadith has been under discussion not only amongst those who are of a secular persuasion, but even amongst those who are of a religious persuasion. And I think though that the debate started much earlier. In fact, if I look at the Western Academy, I would say that it really began with this book, The Introduction to Islamic Theology and Law by Ignaz Goldziher. This was a book on the Hadith. It was a study of the Hadith. He translated it. Then his student Joseph Schacht also wrote The Origin of Muhammadan Jurisprudence, which was again an extremely detailed study of the Hadith tradition. Both these scholars argued that the Hadith tradition could not be considered to be absolutely authentic, although there is an element in it which of course dates from the Prophet. But not only is it the case that the Hadith is written 200 years later, or compiled rather 200 years later, it is transmitted orally and so on, but they make the argument also that in fact what the Hadith is trying to do is solve the conflicts of the present. In other words, the last 200 years of civil war. That's really what the Hadith is actually trying to address. But if you don't accept those arguments, you can also look at Ahmad al-Shamsi's work, The Canonization of Islamic Law, a Social and Intellectual History, which I think is an equally excellent study of the Hadith without necessarily questioning the Hadith, but certainly looking at the process through which it comes together. And it says much about what that tradition is, what the various processes were. I think most scholars would agree that in what we consider to be the early Umayyad period and in what we consider to be the first 100 years of history, there is no class of people whom we could consider to be the ulama of today. This class of people has yet to develop. This profession is yet to develop. It is just in the first stages of its development. And certainly the state as a whole has not taken on the responsibility of creating or at least accrediting a class of people with an official ideology. So then the task of answering everyday questions fell to, at first, those people who were the reciters of the Quran. Hazrat Umar Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu had sent many people to the various cities, the garrison towns, to be reciters of the Quran. In his own lifetime though, as you know, the Quran really had not been standardized. And in fact, many people argue even the method of prayer, etc., was still being worked out. In various parts of the Muslim world, prayers were being said differently. So you can understand that Makkah and Medina are very tiny cities compared to the area that was conquered by the Muslims. And so as the Muslims spread, they spread into an enormous geographical expanse. And when they did that, and the kind of ideas that they took with themselves then kind of merged into the local geography and created different strains and schools of thought. It was inevitable that that would happen because this is a time in history when you don't have a written record, you don't have written records, communications is very slow. So the spread of Islam largely depends on who settles in which place and what they teach in that area. And then in that particular area, you can understand, or in that particular city, you can understand that the leading scholar in that area will have a huge impact on that area. So the task of answering everyday questions fell to men outside the government apparatus as such. Government is, in that sense, also not really in that kind of direct communication with all the people that they are in contact with, because the center of the government is still very much in Medina, whereas the empire, the state has spread in many different parts of the world. And you can't go around writing to Medina, etc. every time you have a question about namaz, roza, or hajj, or anything else. So who answers those questions? Naturally, scholars that are present in that community, closer to your geography. So local people began more and more to consult with the ulama in their locality, etc. And caliphs and scholars were not initially rivals as such, but this was about to change when the Umayyads' claim to legitimacy was rejected. So at this stage in Islamic life, or in the life of the Arabs, or in the nature of the state, the Khalifa is the ultimate authority after the Prophet, obviously. And in doctrinal matters, in religious matters, in spiritual matters, and so on. But people cannot consult with the Khalifa on an everyday basis. Let's say if they're in Iraq, or they're in Egypt, or they're in Syria, etc. So they begin to consult with scholars who are closer to home. Probably the first school of thought that developed is the school of thought of Imam Abu Hanifa. He was born in 699 and passed away in 767. He was a jurist of Persian origin and naturally, therefore, was based in Iraq. And he developed the Hanafi school of Sunni jurisprudence, which is one of the most widely practiced schools of thought in the Sunni tradition. I think I explained this previously, that the word school of thought in terms of jurisprudence is often referred to as mazhab as well. So you can call it the Hanafi mazhab, which is how Persians as well as Arabs refer to it. It is found in Central Asia, Afghanistan, Persia until the 16th century, Balkans, Russia, Chechnya, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Muslims in India, Turkey, and some parts of the Arab world. He is also called the greatest Imam and the lamp of the Imams, and he learnt also from Jafar al-Sadiq and had a very close relationship with the Zaydi movement as well. And Shias also highly regard Imam Abu Hanifa. He is regarded as the first to formally adopt analogical reasoning, qiyas, as a part of Islamic law, which is that in order to understand things that have not been deliberately addressed, let's say, in the Quran, and at this stage in time, of course, the Hadiths have not been put together. So how do you make law? How do you determine what is the law for this crime or this issue or that issue, etc.? So Imam Abu Hanifa suggested the methodology of qiyas, which is that you reason through an analogy. So if you have a law about some other issue, from that you can extract a punishment or an understanding of a law about something else. This is quite brilliant actually for its time, and the jurists, the fuqaha, and the theologians, mutakallims, had begun their system building before the traditionalists appeared on the scene. So the interesting thing about this whole school of thought, which is a school of thought that most Pakistanis also belong to, is that this school of thought begins before the development of the Hadith and relies mainly on qiyas, on rai. The philosophers to whom qiyas meant syllogism insisted that all answers had to be based on human reasoning alone. And later on, Imam Bukhari, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Daud al-Zahiri rejected the use of analogical reasoning to understand all of these things. They rejected it outright. So in fact, you could call this a kind of rational jurisprudence within Islam. Okay? It is going to use reason, because analogy is based on reason, to deduce certain ideas or certain laws in hypothetical cases from cases that have already been addressed. Later on, we find that there's a huge debate within Islamic jurisprudence on whether qiyas is acceptable or not. The other school of thought is by Imam Malik ibn Anas, and he was based in Medina, an Arab jurist, theologian, and Hadith traditionalist. He also wrote one of the most influential and one of the earliest works on that is could be considered a work which not only looks at what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, but also looks at what were the rules in the Medinian community. His method of reasoning, therefore, is based on ijma. The concept that since the community of the Prophet, peace be upon him, was Medina, the way things were done in Medina is the way things ought to be done in the rest of the Islamic world. So whenever he gives an argument, it's not necessarily by analogy, it is mainly by examining what was the precedent in Medina, what was the legal precedent in Medina. Doesn't matter logically whether it's correct or incorrect, doesn't matter whether it is considered just or unjust by you or whatever. If it's practiced in Medina, he said, this is the community of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So that is where, from where we will extract what the law ought to state. He also opposed anthropomorphism of God and argued for intercession, held the Sufis in high regard and supported tabarruk, blessing through relics and so on. He felt that this was not necessarily in contradiction with Islam. Later on, of course, this is also going to become a big debate, because the Sufi tradition and other traditions that do venerate the saints and so on comes into contradiction with certain interpretations of Islam that consider that to be shirk. Then you have Mutaraddi school of thought. It's also inspired by Hanafi tradition, influential in Central Asia, in the Ottoman Empire, and of course in the Mughal Empire. Ethics have an objective existence that can be deduced from reason, and humans have free will. So this is close to, you could say, the Hanafi school of thought, and the fact that humans have free will is very close to the Mutazila point of view, which of course very strongly argued that free will had to be upheld in order for us to uphold the idea of justice. It also argues with respect to allegorical interpretation, with respect to anthropomorphic expressions in the Quran. In other words, that anthropomorphic conceptions in the Quran are supposed to be read metaphorically. That if the Quran mentions the throne of God and the hand of God and the foot of God, etc., all of these things are to be understood as metaphors. The attributes of God, in his view, were eternal, distinct, and inseparable from God. This is, of course, a very big debate between the Mutazila and the Ashari school of thought that comes later, much later. The Mutazila school of thought that argued that God is perfect unity. The concept of Tawheed means that God is oneness. Not just that God is one, but God is itself oneness. The concept of being one. So oneness cannot be composed of different parts. One cannot be broken up into parts. Two can be broken into two parts. 1 plus 1 is 2. 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3. Right? But one cannot be further subdivided because it is unity. And therefore, for God to have different parts, to have different attributes, is to subdivide oneness and is against the idea of unity of God. The attributes of God, therefore, according to the Mutazila, was an idea that had to be taken metaphorically. This is a big debate that continues for 100, 200 odd years. Okay, we'll cover it later. Next up is the Hanbali school of thought from Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And he was a jurist, theologian, scholar, and played a key role in the Mehna. And he supported the idea that the Quran is eternal. This, of course, was a view that was found in the Eastern Islamic Empire from the Jami school of thought, who said that the Quran could not be eternal because that would posit that there are two eternal beings, God and the Quran. Only one thing can be eternal, and that is God alone. And the Quran is the speech of God, which obviously has to come after the existence of God. So this also turned into a big debate in the 9th century. Well, Al-Mamun in 833 set up the Mehna and said that he would test to see if the senior jurists agreed with the uncreatedness of the Quran or not. That was the only question they were asked. Do you think that the Quran is uncreated? Please answer in yes or no. If they answered in no, that meant that they could not be officials. It's not like they were tortured or killed after that, etc. It's not like the Inquisition. But it did mean that they could not be the judge anymore. And they could also not be what is the concept of the witness in Islamic jurisprudence, which is very different from the concept of a witness in Western jurisprudence. A witness in Western jurisprudence is just about anybody, oh, I witnessed this situation happening. But a witness in Islamic jurisprudence has to be somebody who is of good character, and therefore they actually sign any important document, and they have to stand in good character in order to sign that document, and there's only a limited number of people who can do that. So now today that's no longer the case, but in the past that was how Islamic jurisprudence used to work. By witness here is not meant that if there was a trial and he was involved in it, he couldn't say, I saw him do that bad thing. That's not what's meant. Okay, witness is meant that if there's a deed being signed between you and him, right, then I can, if I'm a accredited jurist, I will then, as accredited from the court itself, will sign that and say, yes, I have witnessed this transaction between the two of you, or this contract between the two of you, and therefore it's a valid contract. So it's kind of like, in that time, the witness was kind of like attesting the document. So he could not attest the document anymore. Okay, it was a senior position. was an important position. So the Mehna got worse after Al-Mamun, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal was flogged, and he lost consciousness. And when he came to, he says, I was no longer conscious, and I have no idea or recollection of what I said when I was flogged. The people flocked to him, and there was, in fact, almost a situation where there could be a riot, etc. He was released. And many years later, though not immediately, but many years later, the Mehna was then closed up. Ibn Taymiyyah often cites, and the Wahhabis often cite Ahmad ibn Hanbal as an authority, and you can understand that he is also a great authority in Saudi Arabia. He supported intercession, respected Sufis, believed in the power of relics. He was against independent reasoning of muftis or private individuals, so he's against qiyas basically. He argued that only highly trained religious scholars were qualified to interpret the holy text, so like the Khalifas and others, etc., could not do that. Only few scholars could do that. And of course, he opposed the idea that the Quran was revealed in time. He was one of the main guys who argued that the Quran was uncreated. Then we have Imam Shafi'i. He plays a very important role. He is an Arab scholar, theologian, jurist. And he was a close contemporary as well as a student of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And his work, Al-Risala, is very, very important because he is the first person really to develop a system in which the hadiths through which the hadiths can be understood and used in order for it to be jurisprudence. The hadith is not in the form of jurisprudence. The hadith is in the form of various oral sayings that are transmitted through a chain of people who have heard it and transmitted it forward, called isnad, etc. And so it's not in the form of jurisprudence as such. Jurisprudence form, I mean, for this crime, this will be the punishment, this will be the evidence, this will be the proof, blah, 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 right? It's not in that form, if you've read it. So to convert it into a legal juridical form, he plays one of the key roles. And to systematize its study, so the science of the study of hadith really owes a great, great debt to Imam Shafi'i. The Imam Shafi'i school of thought is found in Somalia, Somaliland, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Lower Egypt, the Swahili coast, Hejaz, Yemen, Kurdistan, the Levant, Dagestan, Chechnya, Caucasus, Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Kerala, all over the place basically, right? Basically because hadith studies cannot be done without understanding what he says. So he represents juristic preference, promoting the interest of Islam. That means that if something promotes the interest of Islam, it can be accepted. No, he says it cannot be accepted on those grounds. Although it's a good thing, but it cannot be accepted on those grounds alone. As well as the idea of public interest, that if something is in the public interest, that law can be accepted in the public interest. He rejects these points of views. And in that stead, he says it has to be proven from the hadith that this particular law is good. So if I say that a law ought to be implemented because it's good for society, and is it good for Islam as well, he says no, it has to be proven from the hadith that it is really there in the hadith. Then we have the Zahiri school of thought by Imam Daud al-Zahiri. And this is a very interesting school of thought. It's sometimes called the fifth Sunni school of thought in Islamic jurisprudence. He also rejected qiyas. He supported the Zahiri meaning of the Quran as well as of the hadith. This is very, very important because in relation to the Ismailis, they are also talking about the batini meaning of any given verse in the Quran, which is the hidden meaning, the inside meaning, the internal meaning. This is found in Spain and later merged with the Hanbali school of thought. Today, the members of the Ahl Hadith movement identify with the Zahiri school. And they declare that nothing has been neglected in the Muslim scriptures, and hence all knowledge can be found in the Quran and in the Hadith. So you heard this phrase quite commonly, that everything there is to know about the world it can be found in the Quran and the Hadith. Right? So, for example, Maulana Maududi says Islam is a complete code of life. So the school of thought that first argued for this is the Zahiri school of thought. They are the ones who first said that not only that revelation is complete, Quran says, today we have completed your religion for you and chosen for you Islam as your religion. So traditionally the way that verse was interpreted in the Quran was that meant that the revelations coming from God were now complete. But the Zahiri school and later schools then interpreted that as meaning to say that everything that you need to know about the world can be found in religion, that Islam doesn't require any additions from any system outside of it. You don't need anything from the Greeks or the Persians or anything else. Everything that you require is here. The Ghamdi school of thought says, for example, that everything that you require for salvation is in the Quran, but everything that you require for the running of society is not necessarily found in the Quran. Like, for example, you can't find C++ or computer programming or how to run a nuclear submarine or those sorts of things, right? So that debate is still obviously very much something that is occurring in within the fold of Islam. What can and cannot, what is and is not part of the purview of the complete code as such. Then you have the Ashari school of thought, which I've just mentioned, and he was an Arab philosopher, and his main view was to oppose the Mutazila school of thought. And as I've already told you, some of the key features of the Mutazila school of thought were free will and the idea of Tawheed and their conception of justice. Now, the Mutazila school of thought were trying to say that there is an objective basis for what is just and unjust. And that objective basis can be discovered by reason, right? So you can reason what is just and what is unjust. To give you an example, if you do not have free will, it would be unjust to punish you. Because if you do not have free will, then you are not responsible. You are not really in charge of your actions. And if you are really not in charge of actions, then you cannot be punished for your actions. That's a very logical argument. So the Ashari school of thought said, no, this is wrong. Why? Because this is epistemically putting reason on top of revelation, and it is only interpreting revelation in the light of reason. So in other words, it is subjecting God's justice to reason. It is saying God cannot be unjust, and the criteria of injustice is determined by reason. So that they thought is wrong. The criteria of justice should not be determined by reason, but what is it determined by? God. So if God wills you, tells you, or makes you do something bad and then punishes you for it, you have no right to say God is unjust, because what God does is by definition just. That means from eternity it was already given that this particular individual and his wife would do XYZ action. Then would it be right to punish them for an action that was already determined by God in the course of time? So the Mutazila said, no, it would not be. They did it of their free will. That's why they're responsible for it. Whereas the Ashari said, yes, it would be just. And if you think that by whatever logic you're applying to it is misunderstanding the whole situation, because whatever God does is by definition what justice is. It is an error to insist that because God is just or that he cannot command something, it's unjust. The attributes of God cannot be understood by human reasoning. So the second thing was the idea of Tawheed, so that God has attributes, right? So they said it cannot be understood by human reasoning, that his attributes and his unity are one and the same thing. That although God has attributes, that does not in any way imply that God is not oneness itself. Now this, if you look at it logically, you would say the Mutazila seem to be right. But again, he would say that Imam Ashari would just say, this is just, you're trying to apply the logic of this world to something that exists in the transcendental world. And it doesn't work that way. So our reasoning cannot understand how God's attributes can be many, 99 names of God, and yet God can also be oneness. We cannot grasp that logically because we are bound by the material reality of this world. Also, Imam Ashari proposed the idea of occasionalism. So one of the key debates in Islam is about the power, the qadr of God, the power of God, and the power of human beings. As you see, the Mutazila are saying that human beings have free will. We have a certain power, we have a certain qadr, right? But where does that place the idea or the concept of God being all-powerful? Omnipotent, as we say, as we learn in school, right? So if God is omnipotent, that means all-powerful, that everything that happens because of God, then you cannot have free will. You cannot take a decision without God's permission, let's say, or His will. But if you can take a decision against what God wants you to do, God asks you to do this and you do the opposite, you have free will, then that, according to the Imam Ashari, would contradict the idea that God is all-powerful. Because you can take a decision even though God has commanded you not to do that, and you've taken a decision to do what God has commanded you not to do. So how was this to be reconciled? This was to be reconciled firstly by Ashari positing the idea of occasionalism. What occasionalism meant was that every single moment in time, God destroys every single atom of existence and then recreates it. If God destroys every single atom that exists in the universe and then recreates it, there is no such thing as causation. Causation cannot exist. Because causation would presume that you exist from one moment to the next, or that this remote exists from one moment to the next. The remote is falling. But now what you're seeing in Imam Ashari's view is that the remote is disappearing, reappearing, disappearing, reappearing, disappearing, reappearing, disappearing, reappearing, disappearing, reappearing, in every single occasion. That's why it's called occasionalism. In every single instant, it is creating and recreating the world. And who is doing that? What is the power that's doing that? That's God. God is creating and recreating the world in every single instant. And so if that is the case, then of course nothing can happen without God's will, because He is even between one moment and the next. The continuity of one moment and the next is guaranteed only and only by God. On this basis, of course, he also argued that miracles are essential to faith. And miracles here take on a different kind of meaning. Because when we understand miracle, we understand something breaking the laws of nature. That there's a law of nature, that things will go down, fall down, etc. And suddenly something goes up. And when it can't really go up, it's not lighter than air or whatever, right? It starts to go up magically or something. It's breaking the law of nature. But from the Ashari point of view, in fact, if the world is created or recreated in every instant, there is no causation as such, and therefore miracles are just part of the will of God. God wills something to happen, and there are no laws of nature that are standing above, determining the world above God's will as such. So today there also continues to be an intense rivalry between the Ashari and the Salafi school of thought, because the Salafiyah think that the Asharis have conceded too much to the Mutazila and to the philosophers, etc. That's a separate debate, and we might get into that some other time. Then we have Ibn Taymiyyah, who is, as you can see, from the 13th and 14th century. He was a follower of the Hanbali school of thought, and also is the main inspiration for the Salafi Islam. His great quality is that in a time when the Mongols were attacking the Islamic State, etc., he is one of the few voices that very bravely said, we have to fight the Mongols. And you cannot imagine what a brave thing that was. And he actually physically also participated in battle, so it wasn't just that he was saying it and not doing it. But you cannot really understand what a brave decision that was unless you understand what violence the Mongols brought to the world. This was the most violent movement probably seen in that part of history, and so on. Incredibly ferocious and incredibly violent. So he stood up to them and he said, no, we're going to fight them. This fatwa allowed jihad against Muslim Mongols is referred to by Al-Qaeda and other jihadi groups today, although of course the context is completely different. The Mongols, what they did, etc., and what Al-Qaeda and all want, etc., is something the two things are quite different. But his ideas also had a profound impact on Abdul Wahab and Rashid Rida and the Salafi movement as a whole. He opposed the veneration of saints. So this again becomes a big debate. Tombs and shrines and the doctrine of intercession. So he does not believe that anybody can intercede on your behalf on the day of judgment, etc. And this polarized his contemporaries. He was also imprisoned for this. And in his book, he argued that God should be understood as he was described literally in the Quran, as was the view of God held by the Sahaba in that particular point in time. He was put on trial and imprisoned briefly also for anthropomorphism. So he really strongly believed in the Zahiri and literal interpretation of the Quran. You cannot interpret it metaphorically at all. And he also gave a fatwa against the ease with which a man could divorce his wife. This came to be accepted in time, that it should not be easy for a man to divorce his wife. It should be hard, because otherwise men will marry and then just, divorce a woman and marry somebody else and so on. So you have to make it a little hard. So surprise, surprise, he was actually, stood up for women's rights here. The Hadith party now, the party that is going to argue that legitimacy of law ought to be derived from the Hadith, and not just of law but ethical behavior, argued that the Khalifa should not claim religious authority that could in any way supersede the Quran or Hadith. The Khalifa also had to prove from the Quran or Hadith that particular case. This is a very, very important debate. Traditionalists reduced the Caliph to a purely executive role, therefore, and the traditionalists thought that the Sahaba are beyond questioning. So they are the ones that presented the idea that all four of the first Khalifas are rightly guided. Doesn't matter that they disagreed, we have to support all of them. And in time, this idea came to dominate over Muslims, and it became the foundation of what we today call Sunni Islam. So Sunni Islam really comes about in the 9th century and 10th century and onwards. It's not like everybody before is, if they're not Shia, they're Sunni. It's not the case. One has to understand that. To be a Sunni means you have this particular doctrine of the four rightly guided Khalifas. Why did they do that? What was the issue here? The main issue here, of course, was that they wanted an end to the civil war. There had already been so many wars on this particular issue. Who should have been Khalifa? Who was a good Khalifa? Who was not a good Khalifa? Was this particular rebellion good? Was that particular rebellion good? Should we have rebelled? Should we not have rebelled? There had been so many wars on this already that now they said, enough with all of this. We have to try and find a middle of the road solution. So the solution was not to go on endlessly debating what happened, when, why, and who did what, etc., but just to say, listen, just withhold judgment and support all of them. They're all rightly guided. And stop debating it. And in fact, they were of the view that those people who want to continue debating it are the people who really actually just want to bring about more civil war, more civil strife and fitna. Only, of course, the Kharijites were excluded from this particular consensus, because the Kharijites had supported or justified the murder of Hazrat Usman Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu, and had also been involved in the murder of Hazrat Ali Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu. So they were hated by both sides. So they're out. I think I've already spoken a little bit about the Mena, so I'll just say a few words that it is not to be confused with the Christian Inquisition, which is much, much worse, much more intolerant, torture, all of this was much more widely spread. The Mena was not trying to convert ordinary people to a particular point of view. No, it was just directed at those individuals that were part of the state apparatus, to ensure that the state apparatus functioned in accordance with the views of the Abbasid Khalifas at that point in time. Now, and then it was ended, of course, in 851. It came to an end under the reign of Al-Mutawakkil. He abolished the Mena. He made Hadith the hegemonic point of view of the state from that point onwards. He also promoted Taqlid. He demolished the tomb of Hazrat Imam Hussain. He prohibited visits there, flogged to death a hostel owner accused of defaming Hazrat Abu Bakr Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu and Hazrat Umar Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu, flogged to death an Iranian pseudo-prophet from Samarra, beheaded and burnt a Christian convert to Islam for reverting to Christianity, imposed discriminatory rules on Dhimmis, and had an Egyptian Sufi sent in fetters to Baghdad for interrogation. Nice guy. And so after that particular period, we see the rise of what we would call the traditionalists. We see Al-Mutaddid in this period. He suppressed the Zanj rebellion, which is very important. This is a revolt of the slaves that were held by the Abbasids, by the Muslims, who used to work the fields of Iraq. It's just like a Spartacus kind of revolution. The slaves rose up and revolted, and they were at first very successful. And the Abbasids then later crushed them. etc. He was Khalifa for about 10 years. Then began the reign of Al-Qadir in the 10th century. This is also what created the Qadiriya tradition, etc. He was also very much a conservative, and he was Khalifa for 40 years, had a huge influence on the shape and form of traditional Sunni school of thought. Another person who had a massive influence is Nizamul Mulk, because he was Wazir in the Seljuk period. And what happened in the Seljuk period was that the Sultan died and he had an infant son, and in that very small son, I think 7 years old or something. And in that time, the government really fell to him, who was the Wazir, Nizamul Mulk. And he set up a system of, he is the first person in this period, in the 11th century, that he set up a new system called the madrasas. So madrasas have not always existed in Islamic history. Okay, everything before this point in time was all the scientists and all the development, etc. It's not through the madrasa system. It's through another system that's not really even a system. It's just through patronage. Some rich guy says, okay, yeah, you're a pretty smart person. I'll give you money. You live over here. You read your books, etc. And you write. I don't care. So it's very informal. And of course, it occurs through the Baitul Hikmah, which is the house of wisdom created, really by Al-Kindi, etc. And also Harun al-Rashid, Mamun al-Rashid, etc. So when Nizam al-Mulk takes over, he creates the madrasa system. The madrasa system is geared towards the defense of Sunni orthodoxy, attacking Ismaili thought, Shia thought, and ensuring that the state ideology is professed. So they train people in a particular way. The way they train people in the madrasa system under Nizam al-Mulk is that they will teach students, okay, you will hear this argument from the Shia, this is the answer to this argument. You will hear this argument from the Ismailis, this is the reply, this is what you will reply to this argument. You will hear this argument from the Kharjites, this will be the response to that. You will hear this argument from the some other school of thought, etc. This will be the answer. So that's why a lot of people even today feel that the madrasa system stultified the mind of the Muslim intelligence here, on the one hand. On the other hand, it is the key institution that created a whole layer of professionals of what we could call scholars, ulema, a clergy. Without the madrasa system, you would not have a clergy. But the clergy is trained in these rhetorical battles. They are not trained in as such scientific research, critical thinking, let's think of this in a new way, and so on and so forth. They learn by rote these answers to other people's arguments to defend the state's point of view. Much like Pakistan studies, khair. And also very important is Al-Nasir. He was the last person perhaps to try to not only unite the Shia and Sunni, but he was the last person to also try and revive the religious role of the Khalifas, etc. And he denounced the sciences. The Greeks burnt libraries, destroyed philosophical literature. He was Khalifa for 45 years. So आप देख सकते हैं this particular period, खास तौर पे, the 10th century till the 13th century is a period of very strong conservative trend towards a conservative point of view. You could say that this is the period in history that develops the ideas that you today consider to be traditional Islam. This is the period where it really gets off the ground and emerges as the main school of thought. Now, you might be shocked or surprised at least to discover that the Hadith party was not political. In fact, they were Quietist. They were not activists. You know how you have these Marxist activists all over the place. They love saying, yes, sir, I'm an activist. Amar Ali Jan and Aruj Aurangzeb and so on. Well, they were the opposite. What's the opposite of an activist? You never even probably thought about the word. It's this word, Quietist. Okay, so if you're an anti-activist, what are you? You're a Quietist. These people were Quietists. What does that mean? They thought that the proper response to an oppressive government was to endure it. If the government is oppressive, stop your rebellion. Yes, governments are oppressive. Just as the way governments are. Civil war would destroy the community. Civil war is worse than a worse government. A bad government is, you can deal with a bad government. You cannot deal with a civil war. If a revolt broke out, one should remain neutral, abstain from fighting, and recognize the winner as Khalifa, provided he was Qurayshi or at least a Muslim. Holy war could only be waged by the Khalifa. So for example, today when we say jihad can only be done by the Khalifa, it can only be declared by a Khalifa, This is very much traditional Hadith scholarship. All aspects of the law remain valid unless, regardless of the ruler's moral status. So आपको पता चल गया वो ruler तो शराब पी रहा था. Does that mean that the law is now invalid? No. Does that mean I should not follow the law because the ruler is not following the law? No, absolutely not, because you are answerable not to the ruler but to God. So you have to follow the law. Rulers were merely appointed to protect the community against enemies, etc. They were the shields, but they were not sources of salvation. This is a very big change. Please note that early Muslims think that I must follow my imam in order to go to heaven. But now the Khalifa is no longer the imam. His work is basically secular work. It's the work of administration. They were also realists in the sense that they understood that political autonomy, that is, that kind of old tribal egalitarianism, had to be abandoned to preserve social solidarity. The world had moved on. To have that kind of social solidarity, to have that kind of state, you couldn't go back to the old simplicity of early Islam. You had to accept this Khalifa and the dominance that they had. Every alim was also fallible, but the ijma was correct, was their view. So individuals could be wrong, but the ijma of scholars, etc., was considered to be correct. Okay? So what we are dealing with now, as you can see from all of this, is a fragmented world. What that means is that from the 10th century onwards, the secularization of the political order had, in a certain sense, begun. Shocking, I know. But this is a kind of medieval secularization, not a modern secularization. That is, there is no complete break between government and religion as such, but there is nonetheless a shifting of autonomy and focus, etc., and a division of labor. Government was now no longer in the hands of rulers who were successors to the Prophet, merely wielders of brute force. Their work was that they had the danda, etc. Arbitrary government had come to stay, and political thought shifted to other issues. The main armies consisted of recently converted slaves imported from outside the Muslim world. Nobody now was looking to the Khalifa as the guide to religion. That's what has changed. Who are you looking to? You're looking to the scholars. In the next 3 centuries, the intellectual pioneers became professionals, like of the state, etc. I'm talking here. Secretaries, administrators, physicians, astrologers, and scientists. These people became more and more involved with state affairs, and the theologians, etc., became more and more involved with the judiciary and scholarship about religion and so on and so forth. So government, in other words, had acquired what we call an autonomous existence. It was, in other words, no longer a branch of religion. So while the two had not separated in that really kind of strict sense of the French Revolution, they had nonetheless developed into autonomous affairs. Okay? Government has this work to do. This is a division of labor. Government ka ye kaam hai.